The Xel'nari were a species that considered themselves the pinnacle of military might in the galaxy. Their technology was unparalleled, their soldiers near invincible. They had conquered hundreds of worlds, crushed countless civilizations, and brought countless species to their knees. So, when they set their sights on Earth, they expected an easy victory. They studied humanity's military history and laughed at its primitive weapons, firing projectiles at a target, relying on gunpowder and physical ammunition. The Xel'nari were all about precision, energy-based weapons, drones, and automated systems that did all the hard work. They believed themselves beyond reproach, their high-tech warfare far superior to any physical, old-fashioned combat tactics that humanity could muster. Overlord Zynthar, the commanding officer of the Xel'nari invasion force, stood on the bridge of his flagship, gazing at the data screens flashing before him. His soldiers had already decimated most of the Earth's defense forces, and the last pockets of human resistance were nothing more than a nuisance. He scoffed at the reports of human soldiers using rifles and manual targeting systems. The idea that someone could still be using iron sights and scopes in this day and age was laughable. Primitive, Zynthar muttered under his breath. He turned to his tactical officer. These humans have no chance. They still rely on such outdated technology, and their soldiers fight like animals. The officer nodded. Yes, Overlord. Their weapons are inefficient. It's only a matter of time before they're eradicated. Zynthar, with his superior intellect, had no doubt about this. His species had advanced far beyond anything humanity could dream of. Their energy weapons could vaporize a man with a single shot. Their drones could seek out enemies with pinpoint accuracy, never missing their mark. The humans had no way to fight back against such sophistication. But as the Xel'nari forces continued their invasion, something strange began to happen. They started to lose soldiers, not in large numbers, but enough to make the commanders pause and reconsider their assumptions. A few of their advanced scouts never returned from their reconnaissance missions. A few of their soldiers vanished without a trace during operations, their bodies never found. At first, they chalked it up to mistakes, maybe even sabotage. But soon, the reports kept coming in, Xel'nari troops disappearing into thin air, disappearing without any evidence left behind. They were losing ground, and they couldn't figure out why. Overlord Zynthar was growing frustrated. It was supposed to be easy. Human technology was inferior, their weaponry laughable. Yet, something was happening on the ground that even his best scouts couldn't explain. His soldiers were beginning to panic. They began to report strange disturbances, as if something, or someone, was stalking them from the shadows. At the same time, the humans continued to resist. They didn't fight the way the Xel'nari had expected. There were no massive charges or desperate attempts at head-on combat. Instead, the humans fought with an eerie calm, making every shot count. The Xel'nari soldiers were not used to such methods. Their strategy was designed for overwhelming force, for destroying an enemy in an instant. But these humans, they were playing a different game, one that none of the Xel'nari had prepared for. It wasn't long before Zynthar received another report, this time from one of his elite commanders who had been on the front lines. The commander's voice crackled through the communication system, a note of fear in his tone that had never been present before. We've encountered something we can't explain. Our weapons aren't working. Our sensors aren't detecting anything. We've lost contact with several squads. We need backup. Zynthar was puzzled. What do you mean, your weapons aren't working? He demanded. What is this nonsense? The commander stammered, We don't know, Overlord. It's like someone is out there, picking us off one by one. We can't see them, we can't track them. But they're there, and they're killing us. Zinthar's jaw clenched. It's impossible. Our technology is flawless. You must be mistaken. But doubt had already begun to creep into his mind. The reports from his soldiers were becoming more consistent, more panicked. There was something happening on this planet that the Xel'nari couldn't understand. Something that defied their advanced systems and strategies. Something the humans were doing that was entirely foreign to them. As the days passed, the Xel'nari soldiers became increasingly paranoid. The once confident invaders were now second-guessing every movement, every noise. Were they being watched? Were they under attack? The uncertainty gnawed at them, eroding their morale. They had expected to face a primitive species. What they were encountering was something far worse, a fight that they couldn't predict, a force they couldn't measure. And every time they tried to adjust their tactics, they found themselves outmatched. The mocking laughter from Zinthar's earlier orders faded, replaced by the creeping realization that the Xel'nari were up against something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. And as they moved deeper into human territory, they would soon discover just how deadly this underestimated species could be. But first, they had to face a challenge they hadn't expected, a challenge that would soon come in the form of a single human. A sniper. Sergeant Elias Kane had long since learned that the most dangerous soldier wasn't the one who charged into battle with guns blazing. No, it was the one who understood patience, the one who could wait for the perfect moment, knowing that the enemy would make a mistake. And Elias was that soldier. He had served in countless theaters of war, each one testing his resolve, his instincts, and his craft. Now, he stood at the edge of a war zone, blending into the ruins of a destroyed city, rifle in hand, waiting for the moment to strike. Elias wasn't concerned about the Xel'nari. He wasn't intimidated by their superior technology or their automated systems. In fact, he knew they'd never see him coming. The aliens were too dependent on their tech, too reliant on energy-based weapons and automated systems. They couldn't anticipate the mind of a human soldier trained for years in the art of stealth, patience, and precision. They couldn't comprehend the power of a single shot fired from a concealed position, guided by years of training and an unshakable calm. His rifle, a custom piece of engineering, sat comfortably in his hands. The scope was simple, manual, a relic by some standards, but to Elias it was perfection. The old-school design was silent and effective, with no sensors to give away his position. The energy signatures of the Xel'nari weapons couldn't track a bullet fired from a mechanical gun. It was the perfect weapon for this war, quiet, deadly, and nearly impossible to detect. He had already taken out a few scouts. The first one had been clean. A single shot through the skull, no hesitation. The second was just as efficient, a quick, precise takedown. The Xel'nari hadn't known what hit them. They never saw him. That was the beauty of being human in this war. The aliens relied on their technology to tell them everything they needed to know, but Elias didn't need technology. He had his instincts, his knowledge of the land, and the patience to wait for the perfect shot. As he lay in his position, watching through his scope, the city seemed eerily quiet. The usual hum of Xel'nari activity was still, as if the entire force had been lulled into a false sense of security. But Elias knew better. He knew they were scared. They didn't understand what was happening to them, and it made them vulnerable. He had already eliminated a few of their higher-ranking officers, and their leadership was starting to fray. The soldiers were beginning to doubt themselves. It was time to press the advantage. Elias adjusted his position, careful not to make a sound. He had learned long ago that noise was just as deadly as an enemy's bullet. The tiniest misstep could cost him everything, so he moved with the utmost care, his body a machine of efficiency and precision. He didn't hurry. He never hurried. The Xel'nari might have had advanced weaponry, but they didn't have time on their side. They were in enemy territory, with no understanding of the land or the people they were up against. They were hunting ghosts, and they had no idea where to look. Through his scope, Elias watched as another Xel'nari patrol walked right into his sights. They were too confident, their heads held high, walking without caution. Their technology had never prepared them for something like this. They had no way of detecting a human sniper, and they had no way of predicting that someone like Elias was out there, watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He exhaled slowly, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. His heart rate was steady, his mind focused. He didn't think about the enemy, didn't think about the mission. All he thought about was the shot, getting it right. One clean shot. That was all it took. The reticle on his scope steadied, locked onto his target. The first alien officer, the one leading the group, was just within range. A perfect shot. Elias squeezed the trigger, the rifle recoiling slightly in his hands, and the world went silent. The officer dropped without a sound. The others around him froze, looking around in confusion, but they didn't know where to look. Elias had already moved. He had already melted into the landscape, blending in as if he had never been there. The Xel'nari soldiers began scanning frantically, but it was too late. They were already exposed, already vulnerable, and Elias wasn't done yet. He moved again, closer now. Another group of soldiers was marching down the street. They were unaware of the fate that awaited them. Elias waited for the right moment, watching through his scope. He let them come closer, closer until they were directly in his line of sight. They had no idea they were being hunted. They were confident, arrogant even, their reliance on technology blinding them to the reality of the situation. And then, just like before, Elias struck. The shot rang out, and another officer crumpled to the ground. The soldiers around him scattered in panic, unsure of where the threat was coming from. But that was the beauty of it, there was no threat to see. Elias had already vanished again. He was a shadow, a whisper, a phantom that the Xel'nari couldn't track, no matter how hard they tried. The chaos was delicious. The Xel'nari were no longer the confident invaders they had once been. Their belief in their technological superiority had been shattered, and now they were left in disarray, their soldiers stumbling around, trying to figure out what had just happened. They hadn't realized it yet, but they were already losing. Their weapons couldn't track him. Their drones couldn't find him. They were fighting a war they couldn't win, against an enemy they couldn't understand. Elias smiled, just slightly, as he moved to another position, preparing for the next shot. He wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to teach them a lesson. The Xel'nari would learn that the true strength of humanity wasn't in its technology, but in its ability to adapt, to survive, and to fight with everything it had, no matter the odds. And right now, the Xel'nari were facing a lesson they would never forget. The Xel'nari were growing desperate. What had started as an easy conquest had turned into a nightmare. Their soldiers were vanishing without a trace, their officers were falling one by one, and they couldn't figure out why. Every attempt to counterattack had failed. Their advanced sensors, their drones, their energy-based weapons, none of it was working. The humans they had so easily underestimated were proving to be far more resourceful than they had imagined. They had expected to fight a species that relied on brute force, not one that understood the art of war on such a deep, psychological level. Overlord Zynthar stood in his command center, staring at the tactical map. His once confident forces had been reduced to disarray. His soldiers were paranoid, constantly looking over their shoulders, fearing that at any moment the human sniper would strike again. The high-tech weapons they relied on were useless in this situation, and the alien leader knew that. The problem wasn't the weapons, it was the nature of the war they were fighting. They were dealing with a species that had mastered patience, precision, and stealth in ways that no alien species had ever encountered. "Why can't we locate this human?" Zynthar muttered, clenching his fists. His frustration was palpable. His forces had done everything they could to find the source of the sniper fire, thermal scans, high-altitude drones, energy wave disruptions, but each method failed. They couldn't track him. The humans were elusive, leaving behind no trace. It was as if they were ghosts. His soldiers were terrified, their once steadfast morale shattered. The fear was spreading like a disease, and Zynthar knew that fear could be as deadly as any weapon. He had heard stories of human resilience, but he had never fully understood them until now. These humans were not like the other species he had conquered. They didn't bend easily. They didn't give up. And they didn't fight fair. The Xel'nari had prided themselves on their technology, their superiority in every way imaginable. But here, in this war, it was their technology that was failing them. The humans were using their primitive tactics, manual weapons, hidden positions, patience, and it was working. Zynthar was beginning to question the wisdom of his invasion. One of his officers, a young Xel'nari lieutenant, entered the room with a report. "Overlord Zynthar, there has been another loss. A group of our soldiers went to inspect the southern perimeter, and the officer hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. They didn't come back. There's no sign of them, nothing at all." Zynthar turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. The officer continued, but Zynthar was no longer listening. His mind was racing. He had to find a way to stop this madness. He had to regain control. The humans were exploiting their greatest strength. This war wasn't about technology, it was about something deeper. It was about their ability to outthink and outlast the enemy. The Xel'nari had been used to overwhelming force, to quick strikes and automatic victories. But here, in this city, the humans were making them fight in a way they had never been trained for. Zynthar clenched his fists tighter. His frustration was turning into anger, and his anger into fear. He wasn't just worried about losing this battle. He was worried about losing the entire campaign. If they couldn't overcome the human sniper, they would never be able to hold this planet. His invasion would be a failure, and that was something he couldn't afford. He turned to his tactical officer. "We need to adapt," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We've underestimated them for too long. They're not fighting like any species we've faced before. They're not afraid of us. They're toying with us." The officer nodded, but Zynthar could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Even the most seasoned Xel'nari warriors were beginning to question their ability to win. The human sniper had broken their confidence, and once that happened, there was no coming back. Zynthar stood tall, trying to muster every ounce of his authority. "We will not be outdone by a single soldier. We will find him, and we will crush him. This ends now." But in his mind, Zynthar knew that the longer this dragged on, the more the human sniper would chip away at their resolve. They were fighting a war of attrition now, and every shot that took down another officer, every report of lost soldiers, was a small victory for the humans. The Xel'nari forces were breaking, and they didn't even know it. Zynthar had no idea how far the humans would take it. But as each day passed, it was becoming clear that the human sniper wasn't just a thorn in their side. He was a symbol of everything the Xel'nari couldn't predict and couldn't control. The chaos had only just begun. The sniper was patient. The sniper was calculating. And the sniper had already shown them that no amount of technology, no amount of firepower, would ever be enough to defeat the human spirit. The Xel'nari were learning the hard way that sometimes the true weapon was the mind, not the machine. And in this case, the mind was human. Zynthar had no choice now but to adapt, but even as he made plans to counter the sniper, deep down, he knew one thing with certainty: they were not in control of this battlefield. The humans were. And they were just getting started. Zinthar's latest plan was desperate, but it was all he had left. He had ordered his troops to spread out in a defensive formation, covering as much ground as possible to track down the elusive human sniper. Their energy-based weapons were useless in this kind of terrain, too clumsy, too reliant on technology that had failed them so far. What he needed now was something simpler, something more practical. His soldiers had been trained in a variety of tactics, but nothing had prepared them for a war fought with patience and stealth. The Xel'nari leader was willing to do whatever it took to regain control. He had already lost too many officers and soldiers to believe this was just bad luck. The humans had proven themselves adaptable, resilient, and ruthless in a way that was unlike anything he had ever seen. The sniper, or snipers, he wasn't even sure anymore, had turned the tide of the conflict. It was clear now that brute force would not win this war. It was time to play a different game. Zynthar ordered his remaining forces to use a new strategy: hunting the sniper. But this was not going to be a simple ambush or sweep. This time, the Xel'nari were going to rely on tactics similar to the ones the humans had been using their minds and the environment to outsmart the enemy. They would set traps, feign weakness, and create false openings, all while closing in on their quarry. They would make the sniper come to them. While the Xel'nari forces moved into their new positions, Zynthar sat in his command center, reviewing the battlefield. He knew that the sniper would not give up easily. It wasn't just about killing one soldier, it was about the principle of it, about proving that the Xel'nari were superior. That was why they had been so shaken by the sniper's success. The Xel'nari had always dominated their opponents with overwhelming firepower and technology, but the humans had broken that illusion. The sniper was a symbol of resistance, of a species willing to do whatever it took to fight back, no matter how small the victory seemed. Zynthar had to eliminate that symbol. Hours passed as the Xel'nari forces moved into place. The soldiers were on edge, their senses alert, each one unsure whether the sniper was nearby, waiting to pick them off one by one. It was a strange feeling for them, a feeling they were not accustomed to. They were used to being the hunters, not the hunted. Meanwhile, Elias Kane was deep behind enemy lines, watching. The hunt had shifted now. He wasn't simply waiting for the perfect moment anymore. Now he was tracking the Xel'nari, watching their every move as they tried to anticipate his next strike. He knew their strategy, their desperation. They were trying to force him into a mistake, trying to outthink him. But Elias had spent years honing his skills. He had survived against impossible odds, and he wasn't about to be outsmarted by a machine-led army. He had seen the change in their behavior. The Xel'nari were getting sloppier, more unpredictable. They were scared, and fear made them dangerous. He could hear them, the sound of their boots hitting the ground, the faint hum of their energy weapons as they moved through the ruins. But they were never in the right position. They were too spread out, too eager. And that was exactly what Elias wanted. He moved quickly, shifting from one vantage point to another, always staying a few steps ahead. He knew the terrain better than they did. He knew where the shadows were thick, where the ruins offered the best cover. And he knew that if he could continue to pick them off one by one, they would start to doubt themselves even more. The Xel'nari were not accustomed to being in a position where they had to think like this. Their technology had always done the thinking for them. Elias wasn't just picking off soldiers for the sake of it. Every shot he took was a message. Every time he eliminated an officer, he made sure the others saw it. He wanted the Xel'nari to understand that their technological superiority meant nothing in this fight. This wasn't about who had the best weapons, it was about who had the will to survive. And right now, it was the humans who were winning. The Xel'nari forces tightened their perimeter, closing in on his position. They were getting closer, but Elias was ready. His rifle was perfectly adjusted, his mind focused. He could see them moving in the distance, their forms outlined against the skyline. They were beginning to fan out, each of them scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of movement. But they were too slow, too predictable. Elias already knew where they would be next. He took a deep breath, steadying his aim. The first target was moving across an open space, unaware of the danger. Elias didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the Xel'nari officer dropped, silently. The others immediately went into a frenzy, trying to locate the shooter, but Elias had already moved again. They were lost. They couldn't track him. They didn't understand how he was doing it. Elias wasn't just taking out soldiers, he was taking away their confidence. With each shot, the Xel'nari were learning a harsh lesson. The humans were not to be underestimated. They were not just soldiers, they were survivors. And they would fight until the very end. This war, which had seemed like an easy victory for the invaders, was now a fight for survival. As Elias set up for his next shot, he thought about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one sniper versus an army. This was about showing the galaxy that humanity could fight back, no matter the odds. The Xel'nari had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt, and now they were paying the price. The humans weren't just fighting for their survival, they were fighting for their future, and they would not lose.